Hey everyone, this is Rod Meldrum, the Book of Mormon evidence guy, inviting you to join me and historian Jonathan Neville in our epic deep dive into what Joseph Smith knew about the geography of the Book of Mormon. This is the last of our 5-part series that I believe is the most intensive treatise on the subject that's ever been done. If you haven't seen the first 4 episodes, then go ahead and click on the links on the screen to catch up on those first. But in this final episode, you're going to learn about the RLDS, origins of the 2 hills, Cumorah. You'll understand why I said that in just a second, as we get into detail about whether or not Joseph actually used the gold plates, these right here. Did he do an actual translation, or did he simply read the words off of a stone in the hat as it was buried in his hat? We're going to show you hard evidence, folks, that what the church has taught from the very beginning is actually the truth. Joseph not only used the gold plates and the instrument that God prepared centuries in advance specifically to accomplish the translation, that's the Urim and Thummim, but also that Joseph had to do a literal translation using his own mental vocabulary in the process, some of which was the result of his leg injury, which resulted in his being introduced to some of the thought leaders of Christianity of his day through their books while he was recovering from his leg surgery. And did you know that Joseph added a preface to the 1830 first edition of the Book of Mormon that debunks the stone in the hat, or what we call the Sith theory? Check out all of this and more in our final episode of the full story of what the prophet Joseph Smith really knew about where the Book of Mormon actually took place. So strap in, okay, for this final info-packed episode. And don't forget to hit the subscribe button below, right here, to stay informed about our next videos that are going to be released. And listen, thanks for watching.
Just to get to the origin of the 2 Cumorahs real quick.
Yeah, because this is another aspect that I wish I would have had 15 years ago.
Yeah.
It would have made a big difference.
Well, what happened is that there was a guy named Charles Shook, who was a disaffiliated member of the RLDS, I think he was. And he wrote a book called something like Cumorah Revisited, I think. Mm-hmm. And he said the Book of Mormon can't be true because it talks about 2 distinct populations. But we all know that there was only one population. All the Indians were the same people. That's what he wrote in 1900. Yeah. You know, that was before they discovered the difference between the Hopewell and the Adena, which corroborates the Book of Mormon. Right. But he didn't know about them. So he rejected the Book of Mormon because it talked about 2 people and there's only 1 people according to science at the time, right? Yeah. Which is really ironic. Yeah. But as a result of that, really there's a guy named Stebbins, an RLDS scholar, and another one named Hills, Lewis E. Hills. And I like to joke that the simulation gave us the guy who invented the 2 hills Cumorah. His last name was Hills, plural. But anyway,
that's interesting.
Yeah, so they all were they actually rejected what Oliver Cowdery said, like he didn't know what he was talking about. Yeah. And they said, well, we know the Book of Mormon happened in Central America. And then they did the calculations and they said, well, New York's too far away, so Cumorah can't be there. So Cumorah has to be in southern Mexico. And this L.E. Hills guy, this RLDS guy, actually published a map in 1917, I think was his first one, showing Cumorah in southern Mexico. And shortly after that, Joseph Fielding Smith, who was a church historian and an apostle, said this idea of Cumorah in Central America contradicts everything we've taught for over 100 years. Yes, you know? Yes. And it's going to cause people to lose their faith. Yep. But nevertheless, some of the LDS scholars latched on to this idea of Cumorah in southern Mexico. And now if you go to BYU Studies, it's right on their webpage. It shows it. Mm-hmm. The students at BYU learn the Book of Mormon with a geography, kind of what I call a fantasy map. It's computer generated.
The Narnia map?
Yeah, yeah. But it shows Cumorah down there in basically southern Mexico. And of course, all John Sorensen's work, all the people that promote Central America say Cumorah is in Mexico. Right. And that's where it started. That's where to rationalize all of the evidence we've talked about, they had to say the Cumorah in New York was just an old, tradition, is a false tradition. Yeah, it's called Cumorah, but it never was Cumorah. The real Cumorah is still missing in southern Mexico. And it's...
I've heard even a different take on that. Well, another take on that, and that is that when Willard Bean, who is the fighting parson, and so forth, when they sent him out on his mission back to Palmyra to kind of repair relationships and so forth with that, it's interesting because when he was finally able to work with the person that owned the hill back at that point in time, and so forth. When apparently our LDS church was looking at the possibility of they wanted to buy the hill there in New York as well, but when he was able to finagle the deal and actually get it wrapped up with the what they call the Salt Lake Church, then that's when they began. Well, those Salt Lake people bought the wrong hill. Well, that's not the real Hill Cumorah.
Yeah, there's more to that too.
Yeah.
Because this L.E. Hills guy, he was going around the RLDS church promoting his theory, and Joseph Smith III, who was president of the church, rejected it.
Oh, really?
Yeah. He said, we don't endorse anything having to do with this guy. He's on his own. Because Joseph Smith III was a lawyer and a very careful researcher, and he concluded that Hill Cumorah was in New York, but he also concluded that Joseph Smith translated with the Urim and Thummim. And this is something a lot of viewers don't know that we talk about in our book here. In fact, I'll just mention it real quick because it relates.
Yeah, let's go through this because this is something that's been a huge thing, and I don't know why so many people, it's kind of funny because the same people who promote the Mesoamerica theory, the same ones really promoting and pushing hard on this whole thing that Joseph Smith ignored the instrument that God had prepared, the Urim and Thummim, and decided instead to put his head in the hat and read it off of the seer stone. Yeah.
So I had done some books on the translation, but my friend James Lucas, and I wrote this book, and it's called By Means of the Urim and Thummim, and the subtitle is awesome. Restoring Translation to the Restoration. The gist of our book is that we still believe what Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery said about it,
Well, and even more than that, the Lord.
Well, yeah, of course.
11 times in the Doctrine and Covenants, and through revelations to Joseph Smith, he specifically talked about the Urim and Thummim was the instrument that was used, and the gift and power of God, and the Urim and Thummim were all there. And
well, there's a counter argument to that too, though, because the Urim and Thummim was added later, so it wasn't in the original revelation.
But one of the things that was really powerful that I felt from your book is that when they had David Whitmer come down to come and pick them up.
Right.
Okay. And they were down there, and Oliver Cowdery wrote that Joseph Smith got up in the morning, he looked into the interpreters.
Right.
And the Urim and
Thummim. That was Lucy wrote about that.
And then saw David Whitmer was getting close.
Yeah, you're mixing two things.
Okay. Yeah.
So
maybe straighten that out.
Yeah.
For me.
Okay. Well, people have that question.
Okay. Yeah.
So people think that Joseph was only using the seer stone, right? But Lucy Mack Smith explained that one day when Joseph applied the Urim and Thummim to his eyes to look on the record, no stone in the hat.
No hat involved.
Instead of getting the translation, he received a commandment to contact David Whitmer.
Okay, so
but he had never met David Whitmer.
Yeah.
And so Oliver Cowdery had been corresponding with him, so Oliver Cowdery wrote the letter.
Okay.
And so that was one part of it there, that Lucy explicitly says that he applied the Urim and Thummim to his eyes to look on the book. That's why on the cover of this...
And that was right before
David
Whitmer showed up. So
it was almost...
The translation was practically done by that.
Well, the translation of the abridged plates,
Right, yeah.
And that's why on the cover of this, we show Joseph Smith with the Urim and Thummim. He's actually turning the page. We couldn't find any artwork of him actually turning the page. So we had a guy, a friend of ours that was an artist, portray that.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
And so, but that's an important element of it, that she actually explicitly said he applied the Urim and Thummim to his eyes to look on the record.
Yeah, there's one other one that really hit me personally as I read the book, your book, and that is that somebody had asked him, I think it was in a court of law, was there any other language on the plates?
Yeah.
And he said no, they were all Reformed Egyptian.
Yeah, and he said
which wouldn't make any sense if he hadn't read every plate.
Well, yeah, he had to know the plates.
He had to know what the plates were, what the language the plates had on them to answer the question.
Well, remember earlier we said that the title page was on the last leaf of the plates? I was at a BYU Education Week presentation on church history.
Just flip all the way to the back.
Yeah. Well, he said, this guy said, well, Joseph never used the plates because they were covered the whole time. He had a stone in the hat. So we have no idea how he knew that the title page was on the last leaf of the plates. He actually said this at BYU Education Week, and everybody's sitting there nodding along. And I'm going, what the heck? How can anybody say that with a straight face?
Miseducation.
You know? Yeah, it is.
In that particular case.
Well, the other thing about this that was really significant is when you read all these accounts of the stone in the hat, they almost all refer to Emma Smith's last testimony, they call it.
Right.
And that was one that...
How many years after the fact?
Well, it was a few months before she died.
Right.
And it was her son, Joseph Smith III, who did the interview. And he took notes, you know, asked the question and so on. And he, at the end, he didn't publish it until after she died, and she never publicly acknowledged it. So we just have him to go with.
Yeah.
But later on, a few years later, he wrote an editorial because David Whitmer was going around talking about the stone in the hat stuff. So Joseph Smith III wrote an editorial, and he debunked everything David Whitmer said. And he said the people who know the best are Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery, and they said he used the Urim and Thummim. He didn't even mention his mother's last testimony. That's how little credibility he gave that. And yet, when you read the Saints book, or they quote that all over the place, and they don't quote Joseph Smith.
As if it's the final say on the translation process.
It's unbelievable. I mean, this stuff is so bewildering.
Okay, so just, I know we're running out of time here, but the bottom line is that, I mean, we did say we were going to go in depth. Hopefully you're not disappointed by the depth that we've gone into.
Yeah.
But the last part there involving the translation process, you had some really great things there that we're talking about the translation. And who was it? It was David Whitmer and his mom, or his wife, Emma, that had given those pretty much long after the fact. But there was a couple of other things though that I remember.
There's a lot of details, but let me mention just one that's fairly recent.
Okay.
So in September of 1829, before the Book of Mormon was actually published, there was a guy in Palmyra who wrote an article. And in that article, he said Martin Harris came in the shop, he kept talking about the Book of Mormon stuff, and he didn't want anything to do with it. And he said, but according to Joseph Smith, he put the spectacles in a hat, and that's how he translated the Book of Mormon. And that got reprinted everywhere. In fact, it was one of the things that's prompted the Mormonism Unveiled, but it was reprinted in all these newspapers. So when Joseph Smith actually published the Book of Mormon the following spring in 1830, he wrote a preface. Do you have one of those copies around here somewhere, an 1830 replica of the Book of Mormon?
Yeah.
Because I think it's important for people to understand why he wrote the preface the way he did.
There's one there. There's also a couple back here in this other one.
And the guy's name was Jonathan Hadley. And he wrote, perfect.
Yeah,
I want an authentic one, not a copy.
Okay,
the
authentic one's back there in that other one.
Yeah.
You want to grab that real quick?
This is fine. No, this is good. So here's the 1830 Book of Mormon. So this guy, his name was Jonathan Hadley, and he wrote this article trying to get rid of the Mormons. Yeah. And he said Joseph Smith put spectacles in a hat, and that's how he translated the Book of Mormon. And then that got reprinted on all these newspapers. So when Joseph wrote this, here's the preface in the 1830 edition, which is too bad it's not in there still today.
Yeah.
First thing he says, okay, to the reader, as many false reports have been circulated respecting the following work, and also many unlawful measures taken by evil designing persons to destroy me, and also the work. Now, what were the evil reports that were false reports circulating? It was this article that he put spectacles in a hat, and that's how he translated the Book of Mormon. So what does he say? He says, I would inform you that I translated, he didn't read it off the stone.
Just read it, okay.
By the gift and power of God, which includes the Urim and Thummim, and caused to be written with a scribe, 116 pages, the which I took from the Book of Lehi, which was an account abridged from the plates of Lehi by the hand of Mormon. So right there, he's refuting the whole stone in the hat thing, right here in the preface to the first edition of the Book of Mormon.
Yeah.
Isn't that amazing? And yet still today, we hear about it all the time.
Okay, so a couple of other things, though, that I wanted to talk to you about. And that is the Joseph Smith's young childhood, as you've mentioned, that he after he had his leg operation and so forth, he was laid up for several years.
Right.
And couldn't go and play with the other kids like would typically be the
Right.
case back in those days.
Yeah.
There was a library in the local kind of convenience store, if you will, the local
Okay.
general store that had books there, and Joseph would go out on a weekly basis and pick up.
Okay, yeah, you're mixing up. I'll
Okay,
explain
so
that.
explain
Okay.
some more of that.
So
Okay.
this all started, you know, when
I want you to get into Jonathan Edwards.
Yeah, I will.
Okay.
Okay. So we all think of the restoration starting with the first vision, right? Don't we hear that all the time? Well, what did Joseph Smith say? He gets back again to this whole video. What did Joseph Smith say? Someone came to him and said, I want you to tell me how this all started. And he said, well, it started when I was a young boy, around 6 years old. That's when the restoration started. How many times have you heard that before? But that's what you can read in the Joseph Smith papers. And what he was alluding to is the leg surgery, which was basically a near-death experience for him.
Yeah.
And you know, I've had a near-death experience, and I know what it's like to kind of be on the other side and all that stuff, and it changes your whole outlook.
Yeah.
And so he became a religious seeker at a young age. And his uncle took him down to the seacoast in Massachusetts to recover. And so I was interested in what would he be doing, laid up in bed with his leg all bandaged up. He couldn't even walk. In fact, even by the time years later when they went to Palmyra, he was on crutches.
Yeah.
And so what would he be doing? And I found a real interesting thing. There's a minister in the area near Salem, Massachusetts, who wrote, I think it was four sermons for young men. And so I read through those sermons, and there's a lot of Book of Mormon language in there, in these 4 sermons. That's distinctive. Now, when I say Book of Mormon language, I mean non-biblical Book of Mormon language, because we all recognize that
chapters and so
majority, let's say, of the Book of Mormon language is biblical. Biblical terminology, phraseology, and so on. Some direct quotes, of course. But there's a lot of it that's not anywhere in the King James Version. So my curiosity was, where did that come from? Because if he was the translator, he had to have that language in his head. So I read through these 4 sermons for young men. I started thinking, whoa, there's some phrases that kind of show up in the Book of Mormon many years later. And so I thought, well, he started as a religious seeker at a young age because of this near-death experience. And that continued through the time they moved to Palmyra. Well, the other thing I was doing was I had a list of, I think it was 700 non-biblical words in the Book of Mormon. I want to know where they came from. You got a
lot of your own word print and phraseology and so forth, analysis.
Yeah, well, I had some spare time when we lived in Africa. That's a long story, but I was able to do this. And so I kept coming up with results from Jonathan Edwards. And I thought, well, Jonathan Edwards had no connection to Joseph Smith, you know. But I started looking at the list of books that were on sale in the Palmyra bookstore. And there was occasionally there'd be a notice in there about Joseph Smith Sr. not having paid his bill or something. And so Joseph Smith would go there every week to get the newspaper for his father. And
this is in Palmyra?
This is in Palmyra.
Okay.
And I looked at the list of books that were for sale, and one of them said Edwards 8 volumes. I hadn't made the connection when I realized Jonathan Edwards had an 8-volume set of his works that had been published. He died in the 1850s or 1750s, but he was very influential. And so I started going through these 8 volumes, and almost all, not 100%, but I'd say roughly 90% of the non-biblical language I can find in the Jonathan Edwards works, including passages talking about the restoration of the church in the latter days and how the church would become glorious and all this stuff. And so I thought, well, that's how the Lord prepared Joseph Smith to become the translator. Of all the Smith family, who had the leg surgery? Joseph did. Of all of them who had time to sit around and read Christian writings, Joseph did. In fact, in his 1832 history, that some of it's written in his own hand, he said he had an intimate acquaintance with those of different denominations. And all along, historians just assumed he knew a bunch of ministers, but he only ever talked about meeting one of them. You know? And so I thought, well, an intimate acquaintance. How many ministers
are going to take their time to meet with the
a kid? And how's he going to have an intimate
kid?
Acquaintance with them?
Yeah.
But he could have an intimate acquaintance with those of different denominations by reading their works.
Yeah.
And he said he applied himself to studying the scriptures. You know, people think he was this ignorant, illiterate fool who can write a letter.
Well, his mom actually had one part where he says that he was the least involved with reading or whatever.
Yeah.
And that kind of thing. So
But
this was when he was away from the family.
He said he was given to deep study, though.
That's true. He did.
That's equivalent to an intimate acquaintance.
Yeah.
And she said he never read the Bible through. First off, how would she know that? But second of all, you don't have to read the Bible through. In fact, this was another aspect of the Jonathan Edwards connection, because back in the day, you didn't have the internet, you didn't have anything. How would you know what to read in the Bible? People don't start with Genesis. You have to have some kind of a guide, right? Mm-hmm. And the guides of the day were the ministers and their publications. There were biblical newspapers and magazines that went around, but also things like the collected works of Jonathan Edwards. And one of the really interesting things was, I could talk about this all night, so we better stop quick. But I just want to mention it because
this is all relevant, though, because
it's
this
really
all
relevant.
goes into this whole bucket of what did Joseph Smith know.
It goes into that. What did he know? And when he said he had an intimate acquaintance with those of different denominations, it wasn't just saying hello or seeing them at church. He knew what they were writing and saying, and he knew the doctrines the controversies between the different denominations and all that.
He wasn't ignorant about all that.
No, and you can see it because as the translator, every word in the Book of Mormon came from his mind. It would be inspired, obviously. He had to, but the Lord said to Oliver Cowdery,
his mental vocabulary. I think is how you put it in.
Had to be his vocabulary
in one of your books.
And his syntax, but also his phraseology. And one of my favorites, of course, is the natural man is an enemy to God.
Yeah.
Because in the New Testament, there's a reference to natural man, another one to an enemy of God, but they're not connected. And Joseph in King Benjamin's sermon put them right together. A natural man is an enemy to God. Jonathan Edwards had a sermon called Natural Men Are God's Enemies, and he talked in there extensively about how the natural man is an enemy to God. And when I saw that, I said, okay, that's a pretty close connection. And when you read King Benjamin's sermon, he doesn't really explain how the natural man is an enemy to God. He just says it and then tells you how to overcome it. Yeah. And as a result, it's one of the most quoted scriptures in General Conference. Natural man is an enemy to God, because everybody's trying to figure out what does he mean by that. And there's even a book written about it and articles about trying to figure out, well, how is the natural man as an enemy to God? Well, if you read Jonathan Edwards, you know exactly what that phrase means, because he expounded on how the natural man is an enemy to God. But I compare it to, like, Book of Mormon never explains the Book of Moses, just refers to it. So you have to refer to the Bible to understand the Book of Moses. And now when I come across phrases in the Book of Mormon that are non-biblical, I have to read Jonathan Edwards to understand what that phrase means. Wow. It's awesome. And it just opens up the Book of Mormon in two ways. And I'll finish with this. It opens it up in the sense of...
I haven't done quite yet, because I want to ask you, so
let me finish this one first.
Doesn't that play into the hands of the anti-Mormons?
Well, we'll come back to that.
I want to hit
that,
though.
But here's how it helps with the understanding the Book of Mormon. Because just like we need the Bible to understand what the Law of Moses is, we need to understand Jonathan Edwards to understand this terminology and the phraseology, like natural man is an enemy to God.
Because he would have been using it in the same sense that Jonathan Edwards was using it.
He was using that concept. Yeah. And that's one way that it opens the Book of Mormon. The other way is it shows that the Book of Mormon is the fulfillment of Christian aspirations for all these centuries. And Edwards talked about this. He even said that the restoration would have to happen in the New World. I mean, all these things, in this country even. And he was living in western Massachusetts, which is on the border of New York.
He's almost like a John the Baptist for Joseph Smith, sort of.
Well, and he sent his son on a mission to the Indians down along the Susquehanna River, about 20 miles upstream from Harmony. And he even called Jonathan Edwards' son went up there. And Jonathan Edwards' son found all these connections because he grew up on an Indian reservation. It wasn't a reservation, but an Indian town where Edwards was a minister. So his son learned the Indian language. And he found all these connections between Hebrew and the Indian language. And he even wrote to George Washington and said, I found all these connections between the Hebrew language and the Indian languages. George Washington wrote back to him and said, well, I don't know much about that, but I know that this German linguist that can help you with it. And Jonathan Edwards' son wrote a book about the connections between the Hebrew language and the Indian languages. And there's more I could go on to, but...
Oh my goodness.
So, but the key point is that Edwards anticipated the restoration of the church, that would be worldwide, and all these things that we know from the restoration. And so Christians of his day were anticipating the same thing. They just didn't recognize it because it didn't happen the way they expected. But it did happen in a place. Kind of like
Christ and the Jews a little bit.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's what I'm trying to say. By incorporating Jonathan Edwards into our understanding of the Book of Mormon, we bring all the Christian traditions and their aspirations into it. And Christians can read it now and say, hey, this really is our book. It's not something that Joseph read off a stone mysteriously. It's the fulfillment of what Jonathan Edwards and others were anticipating and looking for and asking for. And that's why I'm real excited about that, because as Christians come to understand the Book of Mormon as part of their tradition, then they can embrace it. And that's a big part of my motivation. Now, you were asking about the critics, because I've had critics say, well, wait a minute.
Does that mean he was just kind of using Jonathan Edwards stuff and kind of weaving it into a kind of an interesting narrative and basically plays into that whole view of the Hebrews, plagiarism,
and
blah, blah, blah.
the late war stuff.
Yeah,
and see, in my view, it's obvious that Joseph Smith read the late war, because how could you not? It was a book written for students in the biblical style about the War of 1812, which had happened right in his neighborhood. You know, his brother was buried in a cemetery named after a war hero from that. The British invaded like 20 miles north of Palmyra. So how could he not have read that book? But I see that all as the Lord preparing him to be the translator, because one of the aphorisms I've come up with is evidence of composition is evidence of translation. I couldn't write a book in Swedish, and I also couldn't translate a book into Swedish, but I could in French because I know French. So Joseph could translate into English because he knew English. In fact, I have another quote from Oliver Cowdery in here where he specifically said that he learned the language of the Indians to translate it into English. And that he said, first thing he did was he copied the characters and translated them. So he was learning the language. Yeah. And so that's why.
Why would he have to do that if he was just going to take this out of
totally
look into a hat?
And in this book,
no reason for him to study the Hebrew.
Yeah.
Which we know they did in the school of the
He
prophets.
later did.
And so
He
forth
learned that.
And all that. They were major into that.
But in this book, we propose a whole model for how he actually did the translation, and it's essentially it's the idea that when you have an ancient language, there's a lot of different ways it could be interpreted. Sometimes one phrase or symbol can mean multiple things.
Anybody who's learned any other language knows that there's certain things that just don't translate.
Yeah, that's right.
One that I give to people all the time is in Italian. They don't have a word for weekend.
Yeah.
So you'll be listening to them rattling off in Italian, and then they say then they actually say the word weekend because they didn't have. There's no word for that in
a lot of languages do that.
The more traditional Italian.
Right. And so we did a comparison to the Rosetta Stone. If you look at the Rosetta Stone with the 3 languages on it, in order to translate that, you can't translate it literally because it'll be out of order and all that. It won't be grammatical. So the Lord told Oliver Cowdery, which was also Joseph Smith, he had to study it out in his mind. So he could read the characters and understand what they mean, but he couldn't do it just word for word, literal. He had to study it. How am I going to say this? And the Lord had to prepare him to be able to do that by giving him an intimate acquaintance with these other Christian authors. That's why this is so important. Yeah. And related to that also, though, is he said that the title page was a literal translation.
It's the only time that he said that it was literal.
It's the only time he said it was literal. And there's very interesting differences between the title page and the rest of the Book of Mormon we don't have time to get into. But all of this is to say that it turns out, after all these years, that what Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery said makes sense.
We're actually accurate.
And it's corroborated by the extrinsic evidence, whether it's the linguistic evidence or the geological, anthropological evidence. All that evidence corroborates what they said. Yeah. So we're hoping that, particularly this year, 2024, going into the Book of Mormon again, through Come Follow Me, members of the church and our friends will delve into the historical references, the authentic ones, and not the spin given by these intellectuals who have been kind of, along with Benjamin Winchester,
bending things in order to try to make it work for the Mesoamerican setting.
To fit their setting. And it's a real psychological problem because they can't accept that they've been wrong all these years. But I went through it. Ken Godfrey went through it. I went
all of
through
us
it.
have to some extent, because
Yeah.
we were all taught.
But you probably less
Central
than us,
America.
because for us,
Yeah.
we were Mazo guys. And you told us, well, what about this? And we said, what about that? You know, and one thing led to another, and now we're all total
But I
Heartlanders.
accepted that back in high school and my first years at Utah State University and so forth. I mean, I was getting that from the institute and seminary before that about Central America, and I just kind of But I keep going back to when I was reading the book with my parents as a kid, and they talked about a mighty Gentile nation above all other nations, and a land of liberty and a land of prosperity and security and all these kind of things that I just assumed that was the United States.
Well, like Ken Godfrey
I was told,
said,
no, you're wrong.
Ken Godfrey said it troubled him for 10 years until he came across this.
Yes.
So we better finish up and do an announcement here on your screen.
Yes, so we have several things that we need to cover here. Last thing, I just wanted to point this out because a lot of people don't know this, but this is the city of Nauvoo. And since we have our Nauvoo shirts on,
I
want to show this. This is one of the earliest maps of Nauvoo here. And it shows that you're not going to be able to see this probably very well, so maybe we'll get another shot of this. But basically, here's the temple lot. Here's the Mississippi River coming along here. You got Keokuk on this other side over here. And then here's the temple lot. It has a little bit of an arch to it here where the temple was. And then down here in the references, basically the key legend, here, it has several little things called ancient tumuli. And it has these little, almost kind of a spider-looking thing. It's basically just indicating mounds or bluffs.
An elevation.
An elevation, yeah. And right here, in front of the temple, right here in between block 83 and 82 of this map, there was a big mound there. And that mound is almost a block long, as it's shown here. Excuse me, and they actually called it the Big Mound. And if you read church history, several times they talked about how they were going to meet at the Big Mound. Right before they went to Carthage, they met at the Big Mound, which is right there. It's no longer there today, but Joseph Smith, the temple was literally facing a gigantic mound, almost a block long, and from what I can understand from historical sources, it was about 30 feet tall or so, and there's some other smaller mounds here, and right up, clear up here, there's all kinds of mounds up in this area here, and then also right down in here where you have the I'm not sure exactly what street this is here, but basically where the red brick store is.
Right. And
they have where Joseph and Emma and Hiram and were all buried there, and so forth. That between the red brick store and the Smith family cemetery is a Nephite burial ground. So Joseph Smith literally and his brother and so forth were literally buried in a Hopewell cemetery or Nephite cemetery on the banks of the River Sidon.
Yep. That's right.
Which is pretty fascinating stuff.
That's awesome.
So Joseph knew a lot about this. That's been my contention from 15 years ago. But there's, as you can see, a lot more information that we need to that needed to go into that. Jonathan, my hat's off to you. In fact,
well, same to you. We got to get our hat.
In fact, this hat is off to you. You see that? You may have seen this before in some of my other things, but this is letter 7, Make Cumorah Great Again.
So many people thought that was a Trump hat that I made a white one too.
You made a white one too, yeah.
So there you go.
I think the first
Make
couple
Cumorah
of
great
were black on or white on red and red on white.
Yeah.
So yeah. But anyway, there you go.
As long as we're talking about hats, I have a Cumorah hat.
You have a Cumorah hat now?
Yeah.
Okay.
Cumorah Academy.
The Cumorah
I got
Academy.
this in the Czech Republic earlier this year. There's an academy called the Cumorah Academy over there. And it's amazing. It's an international private school that has LDS students from all over that come there. But it's called the Cumorah Academy, and the logo is fantastic. The people are tremendous. I'd love to do a podcast about them sometime. There. And then I've got the ever-present
UT
Urim and Thummim hat, and on the back it has the No Stone in the Hat logo.
No Sith.
So,
by the way, I know you probably don't want me to even mention this, but the stone in the hat, if you do the acronym for that, is Sith.
Yeah.
And it makes sense because that is the thing. But I tell you, Some of the Mesoamerica promotion guys really don't like that very much.
Yeah, they don't like the acronyms.
Because of the Sith thing.
But that's all right. You know,
But,
I don't blame them.
Oh, well.
They have their ideas, and we love them. They're our brothers and sisters.
That's
and
right.
That's no problem.
That's right.
But we don't have any personal animosity or vendetta. They're awesome. So we just want people to know the truth of the historical evidence and make up their own minds, right?
Yeah. Exactly.
As Wayne always says, I present, you decide.
No,
Is that
he
what
said,
it is?
I report.
I report.
You decide.
You decide. There you go.
There you go, Wayne. We got to get that right for you, brother. Okay.
Okay.
So a couple of quick things. We've used a lot of materials here. That he has. Jonathan has several other books. I just wanted to get just really quickly. Moroni's America. Just a brief synopsis, real quick.
Overview. It's an overview of the Book of Mormon geography.
Which is a bigger one here.
I have a
don't
bigger
have
one
it up
too.
Here. It's actually right back there on the shelf back there. But anyway, so then there's here. You go over this.
Well, we don't need to go through. We can put a link.
Just so people know what it is. You can get this all in our bookstore.
I did one called Mesomania.
That was a great one.
The psychology of the Meso, and I have a Mesomania 2 coming out.
Oh yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
We'll be looking.
That's going to be
that
big
one.
this year.
Yeah.
It goes over a lot more than just the Mesomania issue, but that's kind of a psychology.
This is my
book.
personal copy. You can see how all the things bent down.
And then I wrote a little novel called Before the World Finds Out.
I love that one too.
Yeah,
how this affects.
People keep asking me for
the
the next part of it because I didn't end it, and it's number 1 on my list. But my list is horizontal, not vertical, so everything's number 1. So, but eventually I'll have that second one out. Yeah. I did this one, Moroni's Keys, which is about a sister missionary in France who discovers the Heartland thing.
And how it affects her testimony.
Yeah.
And the conversion of other people and so forth as she does that.
And then we talked about this, whatever happened to the golden plates, which talks about the 2 sets of plates. Here. This is this is probably one of the most popular ones because it explains the 2 sets of plates.
And this one, you can get those at the bookstore. We'll put a link on the at the end. Yeah. Any of these are available on the bookstore.
This one, A Man That Can Translate, is my first explanation of how the translation went. I went through all of the accounts, the David Whitmer, everything else.
These are mostly side by side. Things, so you can see where the
you can see exactly how, and that's this book here, the By Means of the Urim Thummim, built on this one. So we didn't replicate this one in here. We just added to it.
Okay.
So that's kind of a set.
So this would be kind of a prequel?
Yeah, they're
prequel to
somewhat different emphasis, but they kind of go together.
Okay. Okay.
This one I did just because it was a bunch of blog posts I did. According to Google, I've had about 1.5 million views of the blog. And so I thought a lot of people don't read the blog, so I put a bunch of them in here.
Yeah.
And then I have,
because of this theory, this is basically, I know this is your blog post, but where does that term come from?
That's where
of this theory.
Joseph Fielding Smith's statement that because of this theory that Comoros in Mexico, members of the church would become confused and disturbed in their faith.
Yeah.
And so because of this theory, and the evidence of that is all around. Yeah. I mean, I think we talked about the survey that, only half the millennials believe the Book of Mormon is even a real history, which how could they when they see all the nonsense in Central America? Mm-hmm. And then the last one I did, most recent, is called The Rational Restoration. Yes. And this is sort of a summary of everything, but it points out that a lot of the quirks that critics bring up as the restoration not being credible or believable, it's because of their misinterpretations. And here I talked about that whole faith model where you start with the facts and assumptions, inferences. And I talk about geography, history, everything's in this one. Yeah. So that's enough to talk about for now.
Okay.
Okay.
Well, so to wrap up here really quickly, everybody, so just a couple of things. First off, we want to just let everybody know, again, just want to thank Jonathan for coming and taking.
Thanks for having me. It's fun to see you.
This is probably going to be broken into 3 or 4 different presentations, and like you said, like I mentioned in the beginning, and actually in my introduction to our this year's podcast, that we're going to do deep dives.
Okay.
This is about as deep a dive as you can get on this particular subject.
Okay.
We also just want to remind everybody that if you'd like to learn more. There's our websites. The bookofmormonevidence.org is where most of our information is, and yours. You have about now 10 blogs or so?
Well, I have several. The main one is called the Museum of the Book of Mormon.
Yeah.
And
Mobom.
it's Mobom, MOBOM.org.
Yes.
It's a nonprofit.
Yep.
And then on that, it's a non-commercial site. I'm just trying to assemble as much information as I can about, that's why it's called the Museum of the Book of Mormon.
Yeah.
And it was originally intended to be a physical museum, and then COVID put a stop to that. But we're trying to put information from a variety of perspectives. I have links to the Meso stuff, because that's part of the Museum of the Book of Mormon. But that one's building and growing all the time. And then another one I have is called nomorecontention.com, because I'm trying to focus on President Nelson's message about we should be all getting along. Why are we arguing about stuff? And the idea of no more contention comes from Mosiah 1, chapter 1, when they said there's no more contention in the land. And the origin of contention really is this compulsion to seek validation by having someone agree with us. You know, it's like, if you disagree with me, then I feel invalid or I'm insecure. And that's where contention is ridiculous. We can exchange views. And so I emphasize 3 principles there: clarity, charity, and understanding. And what we've done here today is a lot of clarity, right? And hopefully a lot of charity, because we have no bad feelings towards anybody.
Agreed.
And then understanding is seeking to understand instead of trying to convince.
And that's probably one of the things that I felt has been so important with what I've been involved with in this whole journey.
Right.
That is, I've told people around me, I said, if you ever catch me being more interested in basically defending my position than finding the truth, if you always keep your eyes single to finding the truth, then it eliminates contention.
Right.
Because the contention comes when you're put into a corner and you don't have a good answer or whatever, and then you have to basically lash out at somebody's character or their knowledge or they're just ignorant or whatever.
Exactly.
Instead of getting down to what's the facts, where's the facts, where's the truth lead us? The truth will set us free, as I mentioned earlier on. And that really is true. So that's one thing I love about you. You are very you give people the benefit of the doubt.
But I have to admit, sometimes I have some fun on the blogs. I make fun of a few things.
But the fact that people take it personally,
well, that's bizarre.
Is actually part of showing that they're more interested in defending their position than finding the truth.
Well, and they're insecure in their positions.
Yeah.
So
if you have a strong position, then you don't have to worry about trying to defend it as much. You just say, hey, this is the facts.
And you know, Rod, you've been really good about inviting people to your conferences that have different points of view.
I sat there on the front row as one guy basically completely tore my research on the DNA stuff apart. I'm like, whoa, hold on. I kept wanting to stop him. And, wait a minute.
But we're cool with that. People can believe whatever they want. And we just want people to make informed decisions. And we feel like Latter-day Saints have been kind of dealt badly by some of these scholars that have deprived them of this knowledge.
The church has gotten kicked in the teeth over and over and over again by some of the nonsense that has been put out there as
but things are getting better all the time. Everything is awesome.
That's right. Everything is awesome.
Okay. So finish up.
So bottom line is that everybody, we want to. We're going to be talking about some other topics. We're going to be talking about the Phoenicia coming up, which we're excited about. We're going to be talking about. There's so many different topics. We have over 350 different experts in every different field. If we had one of those on each week, it would take us the next 10 years to actually go through them all.
That's right.
So one of the things that we want to let you know is that part of the reason why we decided to do the Joseph New is actually because of you guys. Joseph New on our YouTube channel was the single highest viewed thing, so it tells us that there's the most interest in that. If that's where the most interest is, then that's where we want to go deep. That's why I brought Jonathan in. We're going to have other experts in all kinds of different fields. If you like this kind of depth, if you like going into this kind of thing, and not in 20-minute blurbs.
As much depth as we went in here, we could go in more detail.
Oh, by far,
Sure.
And in fact, we do. And the only place that we can, because we have enough time, is on our tours. And so I just wanted a shout out to our tours, Legacy Tours and Travel. We have some fabulous things coming up this year. We have the first tour is actually going to be one that actually involves an eclipse.
Oh,
this,
yeah,
this
you're
coming
doing that.
eclipse. There's the one in
Right.
2017, and then 7 years later, there's the one coming up here in 2024 in April. And we're going to be going to the place where those two eclipses actually cross each other. They're at the southern tip of Illinois, which, if our geography is right, that was the place where Laconius, when the things got so bad right before Christ came to the Nephites, that Laconius gathered all the people together in the center of their lands. They went south. We think it was maybe there. There's 43 fortifications that Wayne can tell you about.
Yeah, that's a cool place.
All across
in fact,
the bottom of that.
The picture on my Moroni's America I took there.
Yeah, yeah.
That mysterious
so
kind
beautiful.
of
Yeah,
rock
it's really
stuff.
beautiful. Yeah. And
Okay.
so that's the area there. So basically, so we're going to be doing the presentations or the tour there. I just think it's fascinating that that's where those two meet, is where the Nephites gather with their 7-year supply of food for 7 years of siege.
Okay.
Anyway, so we don't forget to subscribe. Oh, wait, it'll be over here, I think, on this side. So the subscribe is right over here somewhere, right, or down here somewhere.
Down there.
Make sure you subscribe, and also tell other people, if you won't mind, forward the link to some people, let them know about this, as these come out each week, let them know that's coming out. We're going to do our best to do that. We can't get to you if we don't have a way to contact you. So if you subscribe then also go to our newsletter if you'd like to stay more involved in all of this. We have the streaming website is another great place to go for additional information. We probably have 25 or so of your videos there that you can watch as you subscribe. I know it's expensive. It's like $7.97 a month to subscribe to that, but you have access to over 1,500 presentations by over 350 experts in the field, including Jonathan and Wayne and myself and I mean so many other people that I don't even want to embarrass anybody by not having them in there. Anyway, so don't forget to subscribe there. I'm grateful that there's so much more information that's been coming out. This last 15 years has been quite an amazing ride.
It has.
And you've been a big part of it.
Well, it's getting back to that tour. I never, in my wildest imagination, thought I'd be writing books about church history. That's all because of you. Because you asked me that question, who wrote these articles? And that's what prompted the whole thing. And one thing has just led to another, and another.
Well, somehow I've got to try to convince you to come on one of the tours with us and just be there as
we
a
did
church
a couple
history.
of tours.
We've done some tours together, but you've been so busy, and I've been so busy building this house and everything.
Let me mention one other thing, and that is a lot of people criticize the Heartland for not being academic or having credentials and all that. And so, but Richard Bushman is a widely known, well-respected professor,
probably the
right?
most well-respected church historian.
So I want to read what he said about this book. Okay.
Yeah, please.
He said on the back here, he says, Lucas and Neville's By Means of the Urim and Thummim is a substantial contribution to the translation debates that have roiled Book of Mormon scholarship for the past 20 years. It is conservative in that it restores the preeminent role of the Urim and Thummim in the translation process and virtually erases the seer stone from the story. It also proposes a translation theory of its own that preserves the importance of the Urim and Thummim and yet accounts for the presence of language from Joseph Smith's world. All readers who take the translation debate seriously must reckon with this book. So between that and this other book,
that's huge.
This one here, his Golden Plates book, where he talks about
with that?
What's
That's
that?
the one that you co-authored?
No, I didn't co-author.
Not this one?
But he.
Oh, this is one.
This is one I co-authored with Jim Lucas. This one is the one where he refers to me in all these passages to my various books about church history. What that tells me is that these ideas that you developed 15 years ago that have progressed through the present with additional information are entering the mainstream more and more. And serious students of the Restoration need to reckon with this. Richard Bushman says you have to reckon with it. And in his latest book, he mentions the two sets of plates and all these other things that we've talked about. He talks about Jonathan Edwards. In fact, it turns out, let me tell you a quick anecdote, and we're never going to get to the end of this video. But Richard, I met with him in New York at his apartment, and he told me his first two published papers were about Jonathan Edwards. And he said that
he was very well aware.
Oh yeah, he was well. Okay. He said when they started the Joseph Smith papers, the Yale University has the Jonathan Edwards papers, and it's like a world-class outfit. And they actually had some of them consult with the Joseph Smith papers, and he said, at the time we wanted to figure out some way to tie the two together, and we just didn't see the connection. He said, you should have been here 15 years ago to make that connection. And actually I've corresponded with the people at Yale because their database omitted some of Edwards' writings that are in the Book of Mormon. And I thought, well, that could be one reason why they never made the connection. And they told me, yeah, we recognize there's some holes in our database and we're working to fix it and all that. So eventually that's going to come together and it's going to be awesome in my view. But the reason I bring that up is it's not only regarding the translation and the plates and the church history, but it ties also into what Joseph knew about the geography. And that's why your work has set the stage for this, and it's entering the mainstream, and members of the church can be comfortable sharing this with their friends. Mm-hmm. Because all we're doing is showing you actual evidence. We're not giving our opinions about stuff that controversy. We're seeking no more contention. We're seeking legitimate church resources and references, and it's being recognized into mainstream. It's pretty awesome.
You bet. All right, everybody. So thank you again for this. Once again, this is Rod Meldrum, the Book of Mormon evidence guy, and thank you for joining us. I have heard some rumors that there's a Book of Mormon evidence guru.
Oh, that would be interesting.
That would be interesting, wouldn't
That'd
it?
be awesome.
Okay, well, stay tuned for more information about that. Thanks, everybody.
All right. Thanks.